Since the Reformation in 1560, Scotland's national church had been Presbyterian. John Knox and his associates had completed the work of changing Scotland from Roman Catholicism to Protestantism. The Scots felt that their pure religion of biblical worship and doctrine, along with their liberty, which had cost them so much, was worth fighting for. In this presentation, Reverend Sinclair Horn will tell the story, on location at historic sites in the city of Edinburgh, of the bravery, suffering and martyrdom of the Covenanters of Scotland.
My name is Reverend Sinclair Horn. For 44 years I was Secretary Lecturer of the Scottish Reformation Society. Over the past 3 years I've been the Honorary Curator of the Magdalen Chapel, which is owned by the Scottish Reformation Society. We seek to make known the principles of the Reformation through visitors coming to the chapel here, and we enjoy meeting and sharing the knowledge of that truth with them. We are here in St Giles Cathedral in the heart of the old city of Edinburgh. St Giles has been a notable church down through the centuries, but there is a part of history that is very important that we want to take up in this film. This is the church where John Knox was minister, and very many things in the course of the Reformation took place here in St Giles Cathedral. We want to focus on John Knox today because his part in the work of Reformation in Scotland is very noteworthy. John Knox was a man who trained as a priest. He came to this situation through his friendship with one of the pre-Reformation heroes, George Wishart. George Wishart had come from the northeast of Scotland to Edinburgh, and he began a preaching tour down near the area of the docks in Edinburgh. And John Knox saw him, listened to him, and became his friend. And from that point onwards, throughout the remainder of George Wishart's ministry, John Knox was instructed and helped to understand what Reformation was all about. And he joined the Reformation band, as it was known, and became the helper and co-worker with the George Wishart. After the death of George Wishart, John Knox had to leave Edinburgh and go to St Andrews. And he went to St Andrews with what was known as his boys, who he was teaching. And he stayed in St Andrews for a number of months. And it was there he began his actual ministry. He began teaching in St Andrews. But something happened in St Andrews that was very significant and important. John Knox attended the parish church in St Andrews, and at one of the services, the minister, at the close of his message, aimed a direct desire that John Knox should become a minister of the gospel. And it was there in St Andrews that John Knox became a minister of the gospel. He toyed with the idea for a whole week in agonizing concern that he was doing the right thing. But he came to the church in St Andrews on the following Sunday, and he preached a sermon. And when he preached that sermon, people knew just exactly where John Knox stood. It's the only thing in the publications on John Knox that we have any idea of what his situation was. There's a lot of his biography and other things, but this was a very important sermon that he preached, and it was to mark him down as one of the great reformers. Up to this point, the three men that were involved in the Scottish Reformation were Patrick Hamilton. And Patrick Hamilton was what we would call more of an evangelist in his day. Then there was George Wishart, and he was a teacher. But in John Knox, we had all three things of teacher, preacher, and also organizer. And from there on, John Knox laboured faithfully for Jesus Christ. You would notice in these pictures that in the pictures of John Knox, there is one notable feature, and that is that he is holding the Bible. And that is one of the wonderful things about John Knox, that everything that he did was in accordance with God's Word. Here we've got a picture which illustrates something of the form that John Knox had in preaching. He had a very small pulpit, but he was able to make his voice heard and make his emphasis clear, and people responded to it. John Knox left Scotland for a time, and he was in England, and then he went over to the continent and to Geneva, and it was there that some of the greatest things happened to John Knox. He became a very close friend and an associate of John Calvin, and that formulated in his mind a form of doctrine that was similar to what his own was, and from Calvin. And he came back to Scotland and began to preach the message that there was to be the herald of the Reformation. He came home to Scotland in the late 1550s, and he saw that the groundwork here in Scotland had been done, and that there were preparations for a work of reformation. And John Knox brought in his organising aspect of his life in the work that he did. He was one of the men who formulated and had printed the Scots Confession, which was to be one of the great books at the time of the Scottish Reformation. He also did a number of things that were to be aids when the Reformation came eventually. The Reformation came in 1560, December the 20th, 1560. John Knox had called a General Assembly. 42 men attended that assembly. They were in tune with John Knox's views and his desires to see Reformation in Scotland. And they sat for 2 weeks in the Magdalen Chapel, and then the work progressed and went out into the country. The banner of the Reformation was held aloft throughout the main part of Scotland, and there was a great response to the work that was being done by those men who had been appointed as ministers. John Knox became minister here in St Giles, and it was a different church to what it is here today, but John Knox ministered here from 1560 to 1572, and he had a wonderful ministry here in Edinburgh. The picture that you see is very interesting indeed, because it gives an indication of the way that people gathered around John Knox when he was preaching. And it's said that the people could occupy themselves. One man says that he wrote down the notes for the first 20 minutes or 30 minutes of his message, but he couldn't do any more after that because of the earnestness of John Knox's preaching. So here was a very interesting aspect of things. So John Knox, he had to leave for certain periods of time because of illness and so on, but he did continue until 1572. But he left a legacy of great worth. And in his last days at his house, John Knox met with the elders and deacons from the churches in Edinburgh, and he began to talk to them of his work and his ministry. And he left one very wonderful saying, and it was this: I know that many do blame me, and do blame my too great rigour and severity. But God knows that in my heart I never hated the persons of those against whom I thundered God's judgments. I hated only their sin, and laboured according to my power to bring them to Christ, who placed me in this function of the ministry and will call me to an account. These were among the last words that John Knox spoke to the general public, and I think they're a very wonderful reminder of the calibre of the man and the sincerity of his ministry.
The struggle for religious and civil liberties during the 1600s was not with Romanism, but with the Episcopalians of England. The British monarchy, which held both religious and civil authority, tried to force its prayer book and church government of archbishops, bishops, deans and church laws upon the people of Scotland.
St Giles has also been in the news, as they would say, of the church in Scotland over many years. And one of the most amazing incidents in the church history that's enshrined here in the St Giles took place in 1637. At that time, the king was trying to take over the aspect of the government of the church. He had produced a document that was to be a source of conflict as far as the people of Scotland was concerned. They saw that there was going to be a conflict between Presbyterianism, where Jesus Christ is counted as head of the church, and Episcopacy, where the king is head of the church. And it came to a head one time when the dean was to read from this document that had been prepared. And there was a woman in the congregation by the name of Janet Geddes, or Jenny Geddes as she'd become known. And she took the three-legged stool and she threw it towards the dean as he was reading. She uttered the words in this Scottish brogue: "Villain, ye winna say mass in my lug. You won't say mass in my ear." And that was a starting point for the work of the covenanting situation in Scotland, where the assertion of the crown rights of Jesus Christ was made by the Covenanters.
When King Charles I and his successors endeavoured to force the Scots to conform is when the conflict became severe and even bloody. For over 50 years, the Scots fought a long and bitter fight until 1688, when they succeeded in re-establishing Presbyterianism in Scotland.